sorry. What's the day and time?
Cancel.
No problem. No new alarm set.
All right, and it looks like we're streaming live for our Facebook audience. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm Ben Pogue. I'm the Democratic nominee for Ninth Circuit Solicitor, and this is our Restorative Justice Forums. Our series has just a couple of forums left before the election, and they're really important. Tonight's topic is guns, people, and justice. And we're really trying to engage the community in our restorative justice forums. Restorative justice is largely about community engagement to help move the discussions forward that sometimes heal us, that bring up issues, that allow us to share perspectives. Just as a side note, even though I'm the Democratic nominee for Ninth Circuit Solicitor, none of our panelists or our participants, just by way of their participation, endorse our campaign in any way. We want this to be a discussion that's open to everyone, where everyone can feel free to share their views, and we prioritize safe spaces for that, whether it's in our breakout rooms, which the public does not see, or whether it's in this more public discussion that you can see on Facebook Live right now. I'm pleased to introduce some of our panelists, so I'm going to switch the view so that you can see some of them. Right now, I'm the speaker, so you see me, and I'm going to start off with Brenda Moss. And Brenda, I'm going to pin your video over here so people can see you as I introduce you. Brenda is a survivor, a life coach, a motivational speaker, an evangelist and encourager. And Brenda, I love the way that you put that on your website. And Brenda is also the author of 7 books, and she's the head of Very Necessary Coaching. She's going to be a guest on national ABC News. So Brenda, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
My good friend, Pastor Thomas Dixon. There, Pastor Dixon, I'm going to pin you on there too, so that you can, so that everybody can see you.
All right.
In case you don't know Pastor Dixon, he is a former U.S. Senate candidate, a community advocate, a great political activist, former alcoholic, drug addict, and ex-offender. But Pastor Dixon is now a passionate community advocate who serves on a number of national boards for organizations around the country. And in 2018, he was awarded the Wiley A. Branton Award by the National Bar Association for his work to end gun violence. Pastor Dixon, we're so glad to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Nicole Villafain, a native Atlantan. Nicole, we're glad you're joining us from Georgia. Worked in the Superior Court and District Attorney's Office as an administrator and assistant for nearly 20 years, which is a big part of what is now her advocacy and leadership in working with gun violence survivors. She's a survivor of homicide, an advocate for Moms Demand Action as the state legislative lead, and her experience in judicial procedures from arrest all the way to incarceration and beyond for the survivors of homicide really lends her a unique perspective. So Nicole, we're glad you're here and thank you for sharing that with us this evening. And our final panelist is my good friend, Duke Hagerty, who's a surgeon, a physician, a gun sense advocate, well-known in the Charleston area, went to undergrad at Johns Hopkins, Duke appropriately for medical school, and then did his residency at Emory before returning to be back with us in Charleston. And it's really one of the, I believe, Duke, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the founders of Arm in Arm. Is that correct? Do I get that right?
Yes.
Fantastic. And if you joined us last week when we were talking about domestic violence and domestic violence solutions, Duke was our breakout panelist. We'll be joined a little bit later on by a breakout guest, but first we want to really get into the discussion this evening, which is, as I mentioned, guns, people, and justice. And it's not an easy topic because a lot of times when we're talking about guns, it's wrapped up in our history, especially here in Charleston. North Charleston is the site of Walter Scott being killed by a North Charleston police officer, Michael Slager. Charleston, just a mile down the road from the office that I'm sitting in, my law office, was the site of the Emanuel AME massacre. And in the aftermath, we are the place that the Charleston loophole is named for. So we've got issues down here. But we don't move forward on these issues, especially when it comes to gun violence, unless we engage folks in the discussion. And really, there's no perspective that is more valuable than that of victims and survivors. If you've been following our restorative justice forums and our campaign, you know that we prioritize those perspectives of victims and survivors. So Brenda and Nichole, if I could start with you. I know that this is difficult, and I can't thank you enough for sharing your experiences, but this is something that folks need to hear. And you are leaders in this area and coaches and advocates. If you could start off, Brenda, Nichole, whoever wants to go first, telling us a little bit about your experience and what it's really like to be someone in all kinds of these contexts in which gun violence and death occurs.
Yes, so I will start. My experience with gun violence stems from the murder of my son, my oldest son, Sean, who was killed in August 2014. He was shot 17 times by a person that should not have had a gun. So not knowing what to do or who to go to, you figure the best place to start is to start talking about it. So I just began to tell anybody that would listen, and whether they wouldn't listen, I kept talking. And so when you live with this every day, you have to understand that it is there every day. It is something that you push through every day. You don't wish this on anybody. You don't ever want anybody in this group. Listen, I don't want you here. What I want is for you to be responsible for the choice that you make. I don't want your guns. I don't want your rights. I just want you to be responsible for the choice that you make.
Thank you, Brenda. And Nichole, one of the things that you talk about is not just your experience, but leading survivors through their experience and promoting happiness as well. Can you share with us a little bit about your experience with your son and your work?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. First, I just want to make a correction. It was nearly 15 years, not 20 years, but no, it's okay. It's okay, because I probably wrote it fast. So
No, sorry, my mistake. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. But yes, so my experience being that I worked for the prosecutor's office for nearly 15 years, and it actually being our case, I had experience in knowing what to expect from the judicial system, from investigation to arrest, to court proceedings, to conviction. And I try my best now that I'm on the other side of grief, and I know that you can still, there's a life on the other side of grief. There's joy, your joy is restored. You're able to live life and actually, I don't want to say accept, because some people have a hard time with acceptance, but you're able to receive the transition of your child from their physical being to, let's say, their spiritual being. And my work is to help those come through that and be able to still celebrate their loved one as if they're here, but just in a different realm. And know that there is a purpose for their life. Their life was not taken in vain, but there's a purpose that now they have a platform to continue to share their story, to lift others, and also to educate others on how the judicial system works, and also their experience now from becoming victim to survivor.
You know, Nichole and Brenda too, one of the things that we hear consistently from victims, Nichole, you're in an amazing spot with an amazing experience, because we hear consistently from victims that they feel unsure about the process, and that unfortunately a lot of times they don't get enough information about what's happening and sort of a peek behind the doors. Can you talk to the experience of individuals who are going through that, the challenges that people have when they are survivors, and especially when they don't really know what the court system has in store for them?
So I think, and that's a great question. I think what primarily happens is that for all of us, our children are our primary need. Like, they are our center, right? And so they're very important to us. And we want that projected when something like this occurs to everyone else. What we don't see is how many cases come across the desk at the district attorney's or the solicitor's office that our case may have fallen into that number, unfortunately. And there's a lot of things that happen behind the scene. It doesn't mean that the DA or the solicitor is negating that responsibility, but that they also have to include and that they also have to respectfully include the other people that came before us. And so there's a procedure that happens when someone is murdered. And we want to make sure on the prosecuting side that, one, we have the right person. Two, we have enough evidence to convict that person without any prejudice. And three, that the family is somehow rectified. I mean, they never can be, because your child can never come back to you. But through the judicial system, we just want to make sure that justice is served. And that could be a process. And that process can last anywhere from, unfortunately, up to 2 years, 3 years, depending on where it falls in the court. I mean, there's so many different technicalities that happen in the court procedures. And, you know, a lot of times our survivors get a little distressed because they're calling their victim advocate. They're trying to find out what's going on. But the victim advocate has so many cases ahead of her or him that they have to address. And maybe they're in court, maybe they're holding up another family's hand. And where I would like to be in that is the person that can hold that person's hand through the process and reassure them that your case is not being neglected, your case is not being ignored, and that they are on it. It's just that they have, unfortunately, gun violence is very, very, very prevalent in the United States. And murders happen, unfortunately, by the day. And so many cases come across, and, you know, we need to make sure as a judicial system that that the families understand that their loved ones are important to us.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. We were talking before we went live on Facebook. You and I are a fan of the same person, Sherry Boston.
Yes.
It seems like it makes a difference. And Brenda, this for you too, when you have people around you who are really focused on the needs of the victims, it seems to make a huge difference, especially when you've got somebody who's in a judicial leadership role to really focus on what victims need as well.
I think as survivors of gun violence, you have to understand you have to be your own advocate. You can't wait for somebody to advocate for you. You can't sit around and hope that they're going to do it. You have the right to ask the questions. You have the right to say what is going on. You have the right to say, did you check this or did you not check that? You have the right to say what is going to happen in that courtroom, what you will allow in that newspaper. I had to go to the newspaper office and say to them, you will not print this again. You will not. So you must become your biggest advocate. As Nichole said, there are many, many cases that they're trying to handle, but how important is your case to you? Because my son was important to me, and I was determined he was not going to be left behind. He was not just going to be a statistic. He was my boy, and I meant that the world was going to know what happened to him, and he was going to be vindicated for what happened to him.
Wow. Brenda, thank you for sharing that. When we look at powerful women like you, it's easy to sort of see what we can aspire to. When we've got, though, as Nichole, as you mentioned, it's such a widespread problem, and I want to bring in Duke Hagerty's perspective on this. It's a widespread problem that maybe our justice system doesn't seem to be doing the greatest job of just handling on its own. So as Duke, is there something we can do in terms of understanding the public health aspect of it? We use public health to treat all kinds of other harm to individuals, injuries, sicknesses, illnesses. Why aren't we looking at the violence and harm that is happening in our communities, especially as Nichole said, when it's so widespread, from a public health perspective as well?
Well, one of the problems is the lack of funding of research at the CDC. And it's for instance, cholera the disease cholera had about 400 papers and funding, different funding sources through the CDC, and cholera affect and only 400 people in the country. The gun violence has killed 1.5 million people in this country since 1970. We're still going through 35,000 a year. Most of those, or a little more than half, are from suicides, about 12,000 from homicides. It's costing this country $180 billion a year. And we are, the post-traumatic syndrome, stress syndrome that this is causing to families that have already been talked about is immense. It goes on. And so that's why physicians have gotten together, including a lot of national medical associations, to support that we are in the middle of a health crisis due to gun violence. And that's what it really is. If you look at it as it's a disease, and it's a disease like anything else. And the lack of funding is due to, well, it goes back to the Dickey Amendment and so on, but these are all political pressures put on, and we're seeing it right now today in terms of the virus. When we allow politics to get in the middle of science, we're in trouble, and that's what's been going on with the gun violence. So that in a nutshell is why we're in the middle of a public health crisis. It's ridiculous, and the numbers are there. We can't hide them, and so that's and it needs to be looked at as a disease, and it acts like a disease, and we need to approach it as such.
And thank you for sharing that, Duke. Nichole, yeah, please weigh in on that. And Pastor Dixon, I wanted you to talk about the disparities as well. And Nichole, thank you also for sharing the image behind you.
Yeah, that's Xavier. But
Yeah, please.
but may I ask Duke, I love the fact that you brought up the CDC, because I remember back probably almost 2 years ago, not quite 2 years ago, CDC and Emory were coming together to try to bring the gun issue as a pandemic and as a national health crisis. And
Right.
so can you, because I know like after the government started getting involved, trying to shut it down, and then the pandemic came involved, did that get pushed back? Because it was at a certain point getting ready to be labeled as a national health crisis.
When Ashley gets here, she knows a lot more about this, and I think I'd like to defer it to her. But the problem is that we're way behind, and we've got a lot of catching up to do, and it is what it is. But it's gotten so frustrating that states have initiated their own research programs, such as California, to study gun violence and how we can decrease it. And if I can jump the gun, what we found is that from the few studies that have come out are the obvious ones that we're all familiar with: background checks, responsible gun ownership, and safety, and then there are multiple others, but those are the big ones.
Yeah, thanks. And Pastor Dixon, I wanted you to weigh in on this as well. It's great to hear perspectives of Brenda and Nichole where they see, with the leadership of a strong Justice Department as well, people who are connected as much as they can be. Is that what everybody here in Charleston and here in South Carolina gets? Does everybody get the response that they need in terms of addressing the health issues that linger, whether it's PTSD, as Duke mentioned, whether it's the information, whether it's the communication, whether it's the empathy? Is everybody getting that?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not a level playing field when it comes to the survivors of gun violence or how we address gun violence, period. Starting from the aspect of lives being expendable at the for profit, right down to the fact that those who lose loved ones to random gun violence are not given the tools or provided the avenues necessary to actually begin the process of grieving. This system is not set up to handle, once again, the pandemic of gun violence. We have the pandemic of COVID, where the system was not set up in order to handle it. And the system is not set up to handle the epidemic or the pandemic of gun violence that we have, the epidemic of gun violence we have in the United States, because of the fact that it's big money, because of the fact that we have legislators that are bought out, because of the fact that even when it comes to research, those same legislators block that research from happening, because of the fact that we have a nation that of 300 billion people, and but the guns are 50%. We have 50% more guns available. The gun industry is protected, so that there's no liability to them, even in mass shootings where we can trace the weapons back to faulty dealers, wrong dealers. So there are so many different variables at play here that should be assisting our country in its safety, in its measures of safety, but they're not here. They're not here, and it basically falls right back on the fact that it's a big money operation. It's a big money operation, and unfortunately, in America, lives don't trump guns or money, should I say?
Yeah, and Pastor Dixon, you talk about some of the disparities that we see as well, and we've seen them in our community in terms of response over the last couple months. But we've also got this wide range of reasons that people get hurt or killed by guns. Different people who have guns for different reasons, different contexts. And one of the books we've referred to a number of times is Talking to Strangers. There's a big section in that book by Malcolm Gladwell that talks about the context of having guns around and so accessible all the time, and how that plays into just human nature when people get angry or depressed, because we know suicide is the main reason that people die because of guns. Let's talk about that context a little bit. Why people feel the need to have guns around. What is that? What are the root causes of that need to have it around? Are there disparities that we can start addressing? And are there societal issues that we can address? Everybody feel free to jump in. Pastor Dixon, why don't I start with you on that?
I think a lot of it has to do with our socioeconomic position in life, our ethnicities, where we live at, where we raised at, the gun culture we're involved in. If you take our urban communities where the main economic staple is drug dealing, guns are a part of that culture, and it's inseparable. But if you take our rural America, rural Americana, where you have your militia types or others, guns are a part of that culture. Guns basically are a part of our life, and the more unsafe our community is, and the more unsafe our nation is, the more people are made afraid of the conditions they live in, the more the gun sales thrive. If we look at even in the pandemic, gun sales have soared since COVID-19 hit, and I guess it's because people are worried about the zombie apocalypse or something. I don't know what it is, but they said, okay, we got COVID, let's go buy guns. And so our gun market has soared. But along with that same soaring, there's no responsibility from the dealer's perspective or from the buyer's perspective to say, I think I do need to get educated on what I do with this gun, how to store it properly, to make sure that my child doesn't get a hold of it, or somebody that's going through a mental episode doesn't have access to this. The looking out for penalties, how gun possession is not seriously enforced through our judicial system. There are a lot of different things to look
and desperately enforced too.
Yes,
We
absolutely.
definitely see that.
Absolutely.
And Nichole, I wanted you to weigh on this, in on this too. because of the way you lost your son. I mean, here's somebody who's tremendously successful, who's serving our nation, who's an advanced student, and then suddenly everything goes wrong because, well, go ahead, you take it from there and share your story.
So yes, Xavier was just, he was full of life, just like all of our children were full of life. He was very talented, born talented, an artist, and he was a geospatial engineer with the military. And he was very excited about the fact that he scored the top 5% on his ASVAB. That's very rare. And he called me one day and said, "Mom, did you know I was this smart?" And I'm like, that's why I kept pushing you. You know, I give up on you because I know you're that smart. And for anyone who doesn't know what geospatial engineer is, when civilian wise, they make $180,000 a year. So that should let you know at 19, that was the smarts that he had in him. He also went to the school that he chose in the 6th grade. And that school was Savannah College of Art and Design, which the cost of that school is a house and a car together.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
He was accepted based on his portfolio alone. And so life was really working out for Xavier. He had just proposed to his girlfriend on December 25th, Christmas, who had been with him since high school. And December 26th, he was walking on a bike trail. She had bought him some spray paint. They were going to do a mural on a very famous area here in the East Atlanta area. And it's a warehouse where a lot of rappers do their videos, and it's just got all different types of artists, murals on it. And so Xavier told me one day riding down the street, he said, "I'm going to tag that warehouse." And I said, "Well, you know where I work." So if you get arrested, do not call me. And he was like, "Mom, come on," you know. So the day after Christmas, his fiance at the time and best friend took him as a surprise for Christmas over to the warehouse to do his mural. And as they were walking on the now known as the Atlanta Beltline, 2 people approached them, followed them, and it happened to be one of them was 14 years old. And as Xavier kind of felt, this isn't right, something doesn't feel right, let's turn around. So they turned around to leave, and the 14-year-old and the 22-year-old started to taunt them. And eventually my son just said, "What do you want? What is it? What do you need?" You know, and that's when he saw the gun, the barrel looking directly at him and his fiance and his best friend. And the 14-year-old's job, from what I found out, was to prove his street credits. And so they put a gun in the 14-year-old's hand. He shouldn't have had the gun at all, should not. And he was to hold them as the 22-year-old went through their pockets and to retrieve things from them. As he was doing it, as the 22-year-old came over, he shoved Xavier's fiance, and Xavier just doesn't, you just don't push females, you don't touch women. And so as the 22-year-old came back and tried to hold Xavier back, he flipped him out of a full Nelson, and they landed on the ground where Xavier was on top. And unfortunately, the 22-year-old, not having any regards for life, said, "Shoot," that explicit word, "shoot him." And the 14-year-old pulled the trigger and shot my son with a clean bullet to the head. And from what I understand, the Xavier really didn't know what hit him. It severed several arteries in his brain. So immediately the part that operates his brain function, who he is, his motor skills, completely died. And by the time we got to the hospital, it was 6:30. We waited, and Xavier fought a good fight, but they missed an artery and he bled out. And so with that, excuse me, let me breathe.
Yeah, go ahead. Take your time. You want to be here for that.
Take your time.
It broke my heart. I'll be honest with you. It broke my heart in several ways, because my youngest son was 14 at the time. And I just could not understand or fathom how a 14-year-old could carry a gun around. And literally shoot someone in the head, stand over the body and yell explicits to the body, and then run away without any type of feeling or remorse. But then I started thinking about the parents that raised the 14-year-old. I started thinking about his environment. I started thinking about his foundation. Mm-hmm. And then my heart opened up because I wish I had him. I wish he was mine, because he was phenomenal in football. He was making straight A's. He was tutoring in math. He was like tutoring other children in math. So he doesn't fit the norm of those that are out there. However, his father gave him a very wrong impression of life. He was a drug dealer, low-line drug dealer, had guns in the house, exposed his child to the guns, exposed his child to this hard knock life. And that child wanted to straddle the fence. He wanted to be like daddy. Daddy is the football coach. He's known in the neighborhood. Everyone loves him, but daddy has this other side of life. And the 14-year-old wanted to do that. And so where I came in as far as the advocacy part was that we really need to stress gun safety. And we really need to stress training. If the military has to be trained to get a gun and be, actually dishonored and taken out if they show any type of mental health issues, if the police department has to be trained and post-certified to carry a gun, why is it that our citizens don't have to be? Why do we lack?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to make sense. And Nichole, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, that's a wow kind of story, but it also seems like it speaks to the wide range of ways in which people are raised, environments that they're raised, and what can go wrong. So Duke and Pastor Dixon and Brenda, please weigh in on this as well. What does that tell us about, and Nichole, as you mentioned also through the context of the fact that we just don't have training. Everybody is not trained on this. There's not a monitoring system. So what does that tell us about what we need, how we need to be keeping our neighborhoods safer when we know that human behavior and the range of environments that people are in when guns are part of that context sort of seems to add up to an inherently bad situation?
Mm-hmm. I agree to a certain extent that the environment has something to do with it. But I also believe that we have a choice in whatever we do. And up to the moment that you pull that trigger, you have a choice.
Yeah.
You have a choice. So the young man that murdered my son had been in trouble by choice, not because his parents were bad, not because he didn't have everything that he needed, but he felt like he needed to prove something to people. And so he chose that route. So that was his choice. And I believe when you make those choices, and I tell my two other sons all the time, I don't care what choice you make, there are consequences, good or bad. So we can look at the environment, but we have to also look at the choice. We can look at the environment and say, they weren't given this opportunity and they weren't given that opportunity. But when opportunities are presented, do you take those opportunities? So we want to play, I can't play both sides. I have to be honest and say in everything that we do, I had a choice with coming here tonight telling my story. I could have chose not to. But my choice was to come to shine the light on what's happening and making sure people are held accountable for the choices that they make. I don't care if they live in upper suburban New York. I don't care if they live in down under the bridge. We have to fix it so everybody is held responsible for the choice that they make. And that's not being done. A Black man is held to a higher standard than a white man when it comes to a court case of murder. And we have to look at that. It was still a choice.
It doesn't seem to, when you've got those disparities, it doesn't seem, when everybody's not being treated equally, it sort of communicates that not everybody's being held to that standard of personal responsibility. Duke and Pastor Dixon, what's your perspective on that?
Pastor, you go first and I'll come.
All right. Yeah, I want to look at this first off to the mothers on board that are sharing their pain. You are the ones that have inspired me to stay on this battlefield trying to end gun violence. The fact that for so long the survivors of homicide did not share their stories. For some reason or other, I don't know what it was, but in recent years, in the last decade or so, more people who have gone through, who had this pain, started sharing their stories. And I think that impact on others is a powerful impact that might make somebody decide somewhere along the way not to make the wrong choice. And in saying that, I think we have to look at the proactive aspects of dealing with this epidemic. The stories, unfortunately, they're coming out of something that's already happened. Tragedy that's already happened and will impact proactively, but they're actually retroactive in presentation. The court situation, how we deal with those that have gone through this, the perpetrators, those who have done these dastardly crimes. It's all retroactive. And the one thing that we can definitely take away, that in each one of these situations that we're talking about, it's involving a gun. A 14-year-old with a gun. What is a 14-year-old doing with a gun? And something that I've consistently said over time is the way that we reduce the pain that we see and the effects of this pandemic of gun violence is to reduce the number of guns and the availability of guns. That's one thing that will help to break it down. It's like with homelessness. You break the numbers of homelessness down by giving people homes. Gun violence, if you take the gun out of the equation, you have violence. Maybe a lot of this, maybe a lot of that, maybe again. But we are in a society now where we're spending more time working our way out of the rear instead of aggressively coming at this problem from the front. We aren't trying to create a gun violence vaccine now. We're trying to treat after people are infected, and that's not effective treatment. We need to get ahead of this situation, especially since, just as Duke said, 1.5 million people since 1970, 33,000 a year, and that's a very conservative estimate. We have got to, if we could just first off get our government to understand that this is an epidemic, to accept it. Let me just put it that way, to override the financial, the profits that are being brought in and accept this as an epidemic and treat it as such. Find the ways to get in front of this, close the loopholes, hold our gun manufacturers accountable, repeal PLACA. If we can do those things, then we could begin to get ahead of this, so we could begin to reduce the problems, right along with the fact especially within our urban areas, making sure that other opportunities and avenues are available for our youth that are coming up, other than becoming a part of the problem, and making sure that economic prosperity is available for them. So there's a lot of things that need to be done, but I believe that a proactive approach would begin to reduce some numbers.
And Duke, I think that's I think Pastor Dixon set you up pretty well there in terms of.
Yeah, well, I just first want to thank the ladies. The narrative, just like Pastor Dixon said, is the engine that's going to change this. These stories, the personal stories, is what is going to be the weapon, or the force that's going to make any headway. And then the other frustrating thing is, you always hear that this is such a complicated issue. We never can wrap our heads about it. And it goes right back to what she was saying. It is about choice and impulse. And what the heck with all this. What it really comes down to, what Pastor Dixon alluded to, is the access to the guns. That is the problem. When the person has an impulse or going to make that choice, the only way we're really going to start breaking this is limiting that access. And there are a lot of different ways to do that we could go on, but that's not what this conversation is about.
Well,
But
it can be part of what this.
Well, we could, but I think the most important thing with the stories shared that we all listen to, and you can't listen to those stories without being affected. And it just makes us all furious. And then when I let the fury go, what am I going to do about it? And the goal to me, when I look at it as a public health crisis, it goes back again, access to guns. And that comes back to the responsibility of the gun owner. That has to do with the federal government, the state government, and who's going to get it. Because there are countries like Switzerland, for instance, that has a lot of guns, but they don't have access. The public doesn't have access to them. The safety, their numbers are, ridiculously small compared to ours. So, but anyway, that I've said my piece. I think I should let other people talk, but we've got to work on the access.
Yeah, thank you, Duke. And I'm going to let that take us into our breakout sessions as well. And the real question for our breakout sessions is, what is the role that justice should play? And there are a lot of aspects to justice. So we do live in a country where the Second Amendment is part of our Constitution, where people have rights. So how do we balance that? How do we use our justice system to understand what the balance should be, understand how we should respond to these incidents when they occur? And as Pastor Dixon was saying, how do we maybe use our justice system to more proactively see if we can prevent crime on the front, as we say in our campaign? How do we work on reducing crime and increasing justice before the crime even happens? So for our Facebook Live audience, and you'll see if you're a participant or panelist in the Zoom room, everybody's disappearing because they're getting invitations to the various breakout rooms. So go ahead and click on that invitation. The only person who does not receive an invitation is Dr. Ashley Hank, who's been so gracious to be our breakout guest this evening. And Ashley, one of the reasons I wanted you here is because we've got a great pathway to talk a little bit more about how and why a partnership between justice and public health can really be effective. One of the things that it seems like from this discussion this evening, we need is more data and information about where the violence is, about even where violence is before it turns into gun violence. And there are a lot of ways that you have started analyzing this and researched it already. What can we learn from the public health data that's out there to help guide our policy and guide our response to reduce violence and even prevent it?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on tonight. There's a lot that we can learn from public health, and I think there's a lot of opportunities going forward. I think one of the big opportunities, like you mentioned, is using our access to data, right? And so as healthcare providers, we are the ones that care for victims of violence and victims of gun violence. We as trauma centers collect very robust data actually about our patients, including some of their medical history, social history, other risk factors, for instance, substance abuse, mental illness, prior exposures to violence, right? So we know a lot about our victims. And this data gets reported to a lot of our public health systems. For instance, the CDC has the National Violent Death Reporting System that reports on every violent death in this country. What we don't have is actually a system to count the number of people who suffer non-fatal firearm injuries. One of the big projects that we're working on nationally is to actually use trauma center data from all over the country to actually get better understanding of the circumstances and the risk factors of firearm related injuries, not just fatal ones, but also non-fatal ones. And this is secondary to assault, non-intentional, and suicide attempts as well. And this will encompass thousands and thousands of patients that we will be analyzing not only their clinical outcomes, but like I mentioned, the circumstances, the context, to better understand what can we do to actually prevent it. And the goal, right, is if we have a better understanding of risk factors at the individual level and the community level, right? Because we know that there are certain individual risk factors, some of which can't be changed, right? We know that young men of color are more likely to be victims. We know that individuals who have histories of mental illness, substance abuse are also more likely to be victims in addition to perpetrators. So there are certain known individual risk factors. What's less known, right, is what happens in the community and in their families and in society in general that might make individuals more at risk because of where they live, whether that's employment opportunities, poverty, education levels, access to care, in addition to firearm-related policies. Because we do know from the public health literature that firearm access increases the risk of death. And that's established from the public health literature. And so the more that we know about our victims, the more that we're able to actually design interventions once we know who's at risk and where they're coming from. And that includes using geospatial analysis to look at where our patients are coming from within communities so that we can say, gosh, maybe we should use violence interrupters that target this neighborhood or this community, that if there is an act of violence or a shooting, programs can actually use violence interruption strategies to go to those communities and help prevent retaliation violence and stop those cycles of violence. It also helps us understand what we can do when patients come to us that maybe haven't experienced a violent injury yet, but display those risk factors. So my job when I see a 15-year-old, for instance, that comes in that might even not have a violent injury, but might have gotten in a car crash or have another problem. But I understand that they have failing grades in school. They might be displaying some aggressive tendencies and getting in fights at school. They've been exposed to traumas in their community and their family. I know that that individual is at risk, and we can utilize hospital-based violence intervention programs to strategize ways to address those underlying risks, utilizing mental health services, substance abuse services, mentorship programs, school programs, nonprofits, hooking them up with internships and job training so that we can help change the pathway that some people might be on before they actually commit or experience an act of violence. And as healthcare providers, right, we interact with a huge portion of the population. And so we can use not only our data, but our access to individuals to help provide them with opportunities to not engage in violence or be victimized by violence. And certainly we have a huge role in breaking those cycles and also collaborating with other systems like school systems and the justice system to help identify people at risk and use these strategies to help change the trajectories that people might be on that might put them at risk in the future.
Wow, Ashley, that's like a treasure trove of information. Some of the things that occur to me is that you're getting information through medical histories that we don't typically see through the justice system and analyzing it in a way that the justice system hasn't really done, unless somebody's a criminologist or maybe a social worker, which maybe we should have more of involved in the justice system. But a couple of interesting things that you said that I want to ask you about before we bring everybody back from the breakout rooms as well. You talked about risk factors, and it sounds like you're getting a better heads up through histories of some of the risk factors that are there before there is even a dramatic gun violence incident, which ends up in death. Another part of what I would love you to comment on just a little bit more is it seems like when you're doing these heat maps, and it reminds me of being in a police station and looking at the heat maps that our law enforcement agencies go through, it looks like you've got a better shot at identifying where the real threat, high threat individuals are, and maybe who we need to punish and neutralize for a longer period of time to help diminish violence for the community, to have maybe a more efficient and accurate targeted approach.
Yeah, and to comment on the first portion of your question in identifying risk, that's a huge interest actually in our field right now in trauma centers and emergency medicine, because we have some instruments that have been developed that utilize medical records that essentially take in a number of these elements, right? Whether it's, age, gender, mental illness, substance abuse, prior acts or victimization of violence, if they might have family stress or other prior traumas, if they've been involved in the criminal justice system, or if they've been in child protective services, all of these things, homelessness, housing insecurity, food insecurity, all of these things start to add up to a pretty significant picture of risk. And we've actually, demonstrated some of these tools that identify people that are really high risk of violence recidivism after they've experienced it. But what we're also trying to do is find a way to capture these variables and these factors early, and capture them, like you said, before they become a victim. And so these are some of the strategies that we employ and can employ in hospital-based violence intervention programs. And going back to your point about identifying communities and neighborhoods at risk, yes, we very much see, and I can tell you anecdotally, right, when I start seeing violence tick up, we'll start seeing people come in with gunshot wounds hours or sometimes day after day, and it's not uncommon that we'll see them coming from the same neighborhood within these short periods of time. And
I don't mean to interrupt you, but the stats on whether people are reporting and how often they report are not great.
yeah,
People just not reporting because they don't trust the justice system necessarily, but when there's a real injury, you definitely get those people coming in.
we definitely get them coming in, and we get them at a very attentive moment in their lives, right? When they might not trust, the criminal justice system, they might not trust, the police, but they come to us, right? And there's a certain level of trust that a lot of people do have in the healthcare system. And so it's a way for us to see what's going on in the community and also help that individual. But that's also why a lot of violence intervention programs are linked to hospital-based violence prevention programs, is because we start seeing these trends and we know where people are coming from, and can employ community health workers and violence interrupters to go out into those communities where our patients are coming from, in addition to getting to know our patients and help break some of those cycles, but also employ, nonprofit groups, community groups, the criminal justice system, police, to help strategize in how we can break some of these cycles down within these neighborhoods.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned that we certainly want to look at is also the effect of somebody being in the criminal justice system before, and sometimes that also means separation from families. It seems like you're getting some data on those kinds of things so that we can understand not only what the risk factors are, what the existing violence is, but also maybe how sentencing might impact or even perpetuate crime or violence in the back end.
Absolutely. And also, it can diminish opportunities. And we know that when people are employed, right, and they have a job and can pay their bills and have stability and have a home, that they're less likely to engage in violence and crime. And if people are being, sentenced and not actually provided opportunities for rehabilitation and transition back into communities, it just perpetuates that cycle.
Wow. And Ashley, thank you so much for being here. We're going to talk a whole lot more about the intersection between public health and justice and what we can do with it next week. And Ashley, thank you again. We want to get back to our panelists and get, before we close up here, get some feedback on what happened in those breakout rooms. Brenda, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you. What was your discussion?
The discussion again was how do we prevent it from the beginning? How do we get people to understand that something needs to be done? And the example that was given was when, everybody was smoking in the restaurants. The people that smoked didn't want to stop smoking. But you have to understand that your smoke was affecting me. It's the same thing with your guns. Your gun affected me. So we have to do something about it. I don't want your rights. I don't want your guns. I just want you to be responsible for the choice that you made. That's it. When you talk about Second Amendment, you speak of it as if it belongs to you. It belongs to everybody, whether I own a gun or not. So if I take away your rights, I'll be taking away mine.
Wow, Brenda, you're an all-star. Oh my gosh. We're so fortunate to have people like that. Nichole, okay, I'm going to go from one all-star to another all-star. What was your breakout room? And again, thank you so much for being here and for sharing so much.
So we kind of geared on the what should the judicial system look like? What does it look like to the public? And I have to say, Greg came up with something phenomenal. I feel like he should spearhead it, but he says he has so much going on. But what I really loved is the fact that Greg said that we need to get to the prisoners while they're in the facility, not when they come out. And that because at that moment is when they can sit there and really touch the hearts, really touch the minds of people and say, this is not where you want to come. This is what I did. And this is not, it's not about you earning street credits, man. It's not about you doing, trying to be all powerful. Once you get behind these bars, the story changes. And I really love that perspective. And the fact that now that we have this technology of Zoom and GroupMe and all these other technologies, these detention officers can get in there and set it up. We can have a Zoom meeting and present these people from the facility while they're still in their gear and say, tell the public what it really is. What's the reality of your choices? And I'm gonna give you this, Brenda. It was from a judge. Judge Hancock used to say this when he would his people because he didn't want to hear the excuse. It's CDCs. What is your experience since the choices you made, the decisions you made, and the consequences that came out of it? And that I will leave you with.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And we didn't set this up, but you perfectly teed it up for Pastor Dixon. And Pastor Dixon, this really occurs to me that if we need our prison system, people who have gone through it and been mentors to guide other people, it sounds like one of the things we need is help from our returning citizens who have walked down that path and can help guide other folks.
Yes, and it's unfortunate that for so many years that those returning citizens have been ostracized or kept out of the conversation instead of bringing them in and embracing the changed mind and those who might be able to give more intricate advice on how we can actually address the gun issue. Those folks have not been invited to the table consistently to the table. But we have to look at the big picture in this whole thing, the fact that we do need returning citizens from the prison system to get, because I think most of them want to be involved, to get involved, to give them a pathway to get involved, but also to look at, to make sure that justice, when it comes to punishment for those who commit gun violence, crimes involving guns, that that justice is meted out with an opportunity for repentance somewhere along the way. Also that, and we talked about this in our room, that accountability and responsibility for gun owners has got to be part of the justice system also. We can't have people who just leave their guns laying around, or guns are stolen, or somebody breaks in their car, steals a gun out the glove compartment, and then goes commit a crime, not having some type of responsibility for that. We have got to make sure that the legal punishments, without infringing on anyone's rights, are in place to make sure that we deter gun violence.
Thank you for sharing that, Pastor Dixon. And Duke Hagerty, I'm going to end up with you, and you can help launch us into the restorative justice in 2 weeks. And Nichole mentioned this in the chat, mental health, another aspect to understand about.
Well, the reality on the mental health is a lot more people with mental health are victims than perpetrators. And that myth it needs to be stopped. And in our breakout, we talked about a lot of the things that Brenda, Nicole, and Pastor Dixon did as well. And I get frustrated when I'm trying to think about what we can do on the judiciary level. What really, in my mind, what needs to happen from a public health point of view is that we need to educate the citizens so the citizens can then educate the people they elect. That's the only way that this is really going to change. And that's why it's so important for Brenda and Nicole to share their stories And for Pastor Dixon, you got 3 superstars here. And what I'm doing here, I have no idea, but it's maybe because of my good looks, right? Yeah, right. But anyway, but the narrative is what educates people. It gets them in the heart. And then you'll start thinking about it and making wise decisions and become an educated advocate. And that's what we need.
And thank you guys so much. We really had tremendous panelists. Nicole and Brenda, special thanks to you for doing the continuing work to share your story with folks, to help broaden the conversation. And Duke Hagerty and Pastor Thomas Dixon, thank you both as well. It's a continuing conversation. We hope that we can do more about it to prevent violence, gun violence, and still preserve our rights and to do it the right way so that people, like Brenda was saying, we're all celebrating our rights and an understanding of how they affect one another. In a couple weeks, we're going to be talking about the public health aspect of it that Dr. Ashley Hink was sharing with us. The forum in 2 weeks, which is October 21st, is Justice and Public Health, a partnership that protects. We'll be talking about ways in which we can share data and information in order to prevent crime. Thank you everybody so much for being here, for being a part of our Restorative Justice Forum. A special thank you again to our panelists. Everybody stay safe, continue to stay vigilant, and we can say no matter who you vote for, make sure that you vote. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks.
Great working, everyone.
Thank you guys. That was great.
Yeah, you all are.